Well, everyone knows military efforts are ramped up substantially in this country after 9/11. What many Americans do not know is not only is defense spending up 40% over the last 10 years off of a huge base before, by the way, that 40% number does not count the cost of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Still, Defense Secretary Leon Panetta fighting back against proposed military cuts, saying they would, quote, hollow out national defense and thus can't be a part of the debt reduction. So are Americans expected to continue dying in two extremely costly war efforts while back at home we're struggling with a lack of jobs and investment in the United States? That's supposed to make us more secure? Joining us now, former Representative and three-star Admiral Joe Sestak, who's got some serious questions about Panetta's statements. And Admiral, where would you point us?
Well, first, I think Secretary of Defense Panetta has to answer the question, what do you base your assertion on? Since 1993, the size of our military force has been based almost exclusively on fighting two major wars simultaneously, one in Iraq and one in Korea. General Powell, as Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, established this policy. One of those wars is over, almost, Iraq. And over the last 10 years, two chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have said that although the Army could not meet its commitment for the war plan to defend South Korea, the Army place could be taken by the Navy and the Air Force with the new technology. This is the metric that he's using for the future to say the size of our force is to be the same as it has been when two wars, which had changed dramatically and one is gone, has determined our size. I think that's a defining question. Along that line, my concern has been, as a warrior who really does want to have a strong military that can decisively win, are we really building the wrong military? One based upon size as the metric of how good you are, how many ships, how many brigades, rather than capability to know where the adversary is, like bin Laden, and then have the agility, the speed to respond very rapidly. I think we're still caught up in a defense industrial complex of which Congress is implicit, that's building platforms less good for our warriors of the future.
First of all, I couldn't agree more, honestly, with your assessment, having much less information than you do. And I see the panel around the table nodding. I admire you for forcing a conversation that I think has been desperately overdue. And I'm sorry, Imogen, go ahead.
I was just going to actually ask a question about NATO. All NATO member countries are supposed to spend 2% of their GDP on defence. The only two countries, obviously apart from the US at the moment, doing that is the UK and Greece, and that's not going to last much longer. America obviously spends around 4.7% of GDP on defence. So my question is, have the other NATO countries perhaps cut too much? And would you like to see America cut its spending on defence to, say, 2% of GDP?
Well, I think the other countries in NATO have certainly cut too much. But at the end of the day, having been at the National Security Council for President Clinton as a director of defense policy, it comes down to what our national interests are. To my mind, NATO has for far too long been a political alliance, not a military one. And you could see that they were just about out of gas as they were coming out of August into September in order to sustain the Libyan operation. Now, for the United States, I think that we could have a much better military, more effective, if we were more efficient in what we were doing. Let me give you an example. When I ran the Navy's $70 billion warfare programs, I was surprised at what we did not tell Congress, and that was, what is the confidence factor that we have in the pricing of our systems? For example, in 2008, we told Congress a new aircraft carrier would cost $11 billion. The close hold confidence factor of that being the right price was below 50%. So what I'm asking for is the same type of accountability that we demand of our warrior forward fighting, taking care of his troops underneath him or her, back here and making sure that the money is used well. So I think that before Secretary of Defense Panetta says, whoa, we can't give any more. No, wait a moment. You've got some questions to answer under this tyranny of optimism that the defense establishment has of unrequited funding no matter what. because accountability is what's needed right now for the best for our warriors and, frankly, for concern here at home, debt reduction.
And Ari, you think you have some insight into the political machinery that is helping to perpetuate the toxic system that the Admiral is discussing, correct?
Yeah, Congressman, I'm curious. As you know, there's defense plants in basically every single congressional district. The military-industrial complex has been very shrewd about perpetuating the need for this sort of spending all across the country. How do you marshal your colleagues in the Pentagon and your colleagues in Congress to actually take on the military-industrial complex that you spoke of head on?
And to elaborate on that, how are all those payouts to all those defense divisions in all those districts not a fundamentally short-term bribes to the politicians in those districts with the threat of taking away jobs in a given election if they cut?
As I alluded to earlier in this conversation, Congress is very implicit in this problem. People go to the Services Committee because, yes, they care about defense, but they really care about that shipbuilding base right there at home. What you need is to start articulating, as General Powell did after the Cold War, that we are going to end up hollowing our forces with platforms that don't have the capability within them to search, to find, to get the knowledge in order to apply force. Let me give you an example. Submarines, they cost $2 billion a piece. China already has almost twice as many as we do. Do we just build more $2 billion submarines? Or a netted sensor system that sits out there quietly listening at all times, listens to everything underneath the water in the Western Pacific, sends a signal up to a drone that if you had to drop a torpedo, it would go over and drop it. However, I'll never forget when I proposed that as a three-star admiral to Congress, and a wonderful senator, where submarines are built in his home state, said to me several years later, when he came to campaign for me, and I love the man, said, "Hey, Joe, I still remember you. You're the admiral that advocated cutting my submarine force." We need to make sure that people understand the real metric of the future for our ability to be the best in the world in military, defend us, is not capacity. It's no longer numbers. It really is the capability coming from sensors, coming from the ability to switch information back and forth. And I think you'd have a more efficient, an effective military with even putting less into it. And the kind of shipbuilding program that we had proposed back in 2005 that actually sits in Congress said not 316 ships, 250 would be sufficient if you put sufficient into the sensors that we can to find the adversary.
And
that's going to take a lot of challenge.
I would almost argue that the metaphor you're arguing, it works in almost everything. We could spend less and get more in health care. We could spend less and get more in learning and education. We could spend and get more defense. We just need the willingness to break through the financial grip on Congress of the disruption of short-term revenues. Very quickly,
Admiral, if you could, I mean, do you have a sense, when you talk about that idea that we're not really getting value for the buck, do you have a sense of what that proportion is? I mean, how much of our defense budget is a function of this relationship with Congress, these distortions, and how much is a function of what we really need?
Well, let me give you an example. In 2008, for the 2008 programs that Congress had, that the Defense Department had proposed and Congress approved, they had cost overruns of $300 billion. Now, mind you, many of these, over 25 of these programs broke the cost estimate. Major warfare programs broke the cost estimate of what our Defense Department had forwarded to Congress. Remember, the confidence factors were often below 50%. But there's no harm, no foul. Instead of saying, I'm not going to approve the program until you have an 80 or 90% confidence factor, and then if it breaks it, you tell me where you're going to take the money. We don't have that tongue suppressor for accountable discipline. And the warrior and our economy, I believe, suffer for that.
Admiral, as you may or may not know, I recently engaged in a conversation with a man named Jimmy Williams, who's one of the top lobbyists down in D.C., firmly believes that lobbying is good and getting the money out of lobbying is necessary so that you can have policy advocacy without financial dependency. Do you think it's possible to reform the defense system if we don't ultimately pass a constitutional amendment to get money out of politics?
Look, I don't think we should mess around with our Constitution for that, but I will say this. If you had public financing of campaigns, you'd resolve 85–90% of all the problems in politics, where people are doing things for the right thing, not to hold on to their job.
Admiral, thank you very much for your time and for educating us and this afternoon. We really appreciate it.
Good to be with you, Dylan, everyone. Thank you.
Joe Sestak, and thanks as well to our panel. Not a ton of oxygen for you guys today, but boy, a pile of content. That was pretty powerful interview.
Point to end on that he made about getting money out of politics and solving a